Hi, I'm David A. Fields, and this webinar is Pricing to Maximize Fees and Profits. It's presented by the Association for Consulting Expertise. And for technical reasons, the first 18 minutes or so of this presentation were not recorded. And so you're listening to a re-recording for the first 18 minutes, and then it will cut over to the original recording, which has the Q&A in it, at least some of it. So with that, let's dive in. First, I want to thank you for being here. I know you have things to do. You've got projects to work on, clients to pursue. I know how valuable your time is. I also know what sets you apart and gives you the opportunity to build your consulting firm is you take the time to step back from the day-to-day fires and work on the business, not just in your business. I mean, that's why you're watching this replay. So I'm very glad that you're taking the time to do this. So let's take a little bit of time and talk about pricing and setting fees. Pricing is, in my opinion, the trickiest part of consulting. It's often tough to figure out exactly how to price your services. And so when a client asks you your rates or how much a project will cost, there's this temptation to give very vague answers. I mean, you don't want to price yourself out of a project. And on the other hand, you want to ensure you're not leaving money on the table either. So like I said, this can really be quite tricky. That also makes it a good topic for a webinar like the one we presented here. So what should we talk about? And I asked people on the webinar to type in the chat box the questions they had about setting fees. And just a whole slew of questions came in on all sorts of things having to do with rates and timing and what about nonprofits and all sorts of things. It was really a lot of questions. And those questions, even with all of the ones that came in, really just scratched the surface of this whole topic of pricing and fees. There's just so much we could cover. I actually teach full-day workshops on this for boutique firms, and virtually every day, at least one solo consultant I work with calls me to talk through pricing on one of their projects. And so all of these questions that got typed in really resonated with me. That they hit a lot on the types of questions I'm frequently asked. For instance, what's the impact of fees on your practice? And when and how do you actually set up the discussion about budget and fees? And what fee structure should you use? How do you determine fees? And once you determine them, is there a way to increase fees? And after that, can you negotiate them? And that's just a lot. I mean, that's a lot to cover. And in fact, it's too much to cover in one webinar. And I was given roughly 30 minutes-ish is what we did, 30 to 40 minutes. And so I figured what I'd walk through and take questions along the way and then open up for Q&A at the end, that what I would do is we'll talk about fee structures because it's just really super important and it will help you build a more lucrative practice. And then we're going to talk about how you actually determine fees. And then with the time at the end, well, what we actually did was we did a lot of Q&A. We did some Q&A in the middle, and we did some at the end. And just so you know, I asked folks whether this seemed like the right topics, and I got just a huge mass of yeses and no nos. So we stuck with this. This is what's coming up. And so what we did is we started with fee structures. Here's how I think about fee structures and how I think you might want to think about fee structures as you're developing a proposal for a prospect. I suggest you think of your fees on two axes. On the first axis is the basis on which you determine your fees. Are you determining them based on the cost of the resources that go into the project? So, for instance, how many man days, how many hours? That would be cost. That's down here. Or are you determining them based on the value that the client receives from the project, what that project is worth for them, what the outcome delivers for them, and that's up there. Now, this isn't necessarily what your client sees. They may or may not see it, but it's how you internally determine the basis for your fees, either cost or on value. And that's one axis. Then the second axis is across the horizontal here. Is the time at which you determine the fees. So over here on the left is when you determine your fees up front, which means before you even go into the project, you know what those fees are going to be. And that means the fees are fixed when you head into the project. And then over on the right side is when the fees are determined at the end. And neither you nor the client really know what the final project fees are going to be until the project is done. In other words, that means the fees are variable. So like any good consultant, I've got a 2x2 matrix here. And so we can look at 4 fee structures. Down here is variable time and materials. That's the most traditional approach to building consulting projects. It's also one of the worst for consultants and also for clients. Then over here is fixed time and materials. And that's where you quote the client fixed price, which behind the scenes you may have determined based on your estimate of the number of man hours or days or whatever that it will take to do the project. But you don't necessarily show that to the client. You just show them the fixed price. Up here is where you have value-based fees or fixed value-based fees. And in this fee structure, the number of hours or days, it's basically irrelevant. You and the client agree on the value, and you get paid equitably based on your contribution to that value. And then over on the side here is success fees or performance fees, where you produce value for the client and you get paid equitably based on what the actual outcome is. So the more you produce, the more you get at the end. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to overlay an arrow here that I call the fee premium curve. And as you travel around this curve, all else being equal, and assuming you're good at what you do, the premium you will make on a project increases as you move clockwise around this curve. And the optimal point is actually right here. It's right up here. A value-based fee that is partly fixed up front and partly based on performance. And again, all else being equal, this fee structure will produce the highest margin for you. Now, if you're doing more commodity type work, or your client is hiring you for what looks to them like tasks rather than IP, or they're hiring you for staff augmentation, then you tend to get pushed down here. You get pushed towards time and materials. But the more you're able to work in the advisory realm, the more you're selling your expertise and your experience and your wisdom, then the more you can push up toward the top part of this model, towards value-based, where there's a higher premium. And the one place you absolutely do not want to end up is down here. That's a hybrid model called variable time and materials with a cap. And clients will often suggest this. They'll say, we'll want to pay you by an hour, and we're going to set a cap at a certain point. And they'll suggest that because it feels to them intuitively like it's the best model. They limit their costs and pay only what's required. Now, in fact, it's actually the worst possible model for clients and also for consultants. And so when I'm working with corporate clients, I never let them enter into that type of fee structure, into a variable time and materials with a cap. And let me give you a quick real life example here to illustrate how this premium curve works. I had a project a few years ago with a company out on the West Coast. They just sort of like gone through this integration spree, or this acquisition spree, I should say, and they wanted help developing a plan for the integration of all these businesses they had acquired. Now, this wasn't a big project. This was just developing part of the plan. And my guess is that if this were priced out on a variable time and materials basis, so it's sort of an average, a typical consultant had given them a day rate and done the work, it probably would have ended up being around $40,000 when all was said and done. Now, any kind of typical market rate consulting firm that bid on a fixed basis probably would have bid this around $45,000. Because it's fixed, they absorb part of the risk, and therefore there's a little bit of a premium on there, which is typical. And that was that would have been a fair fee. Now, what I did is I actually had a discussion with the buyer, with the decision maker, and we decided what would the value of this be? What's the value of the outcome to him? And therefore, what would a fair fee be? And what we decided on was $65,000. That seemed fair to both of us. But in fact, what I did was I gave him an option to make this a hybrid structure. So instead of a fixed fee, I said, of 65, I said, we'll do it for a fixed fee of 35,000. That's the fixed portion. And then if we're successful, then we get a bonus of $60,000. So I shifted some of the risk so that there was a much lower fixed fee. But if the project went well, he would only pay if everything was successful, if the project was a success. And so he took me up on that. And of course, the project was successful. And so we ended up getting paid $95,000, which was a win for us, obviously, and a win for him. And so he paid the bonus, and that was great. And that amount, that $95,000, is for the exact same amount of work that any other consultant would have done to receive $65,000 if they had charged on a value basis, or $45,000 if they had done it on a time and materials fixed basis, or more, maybe even just $40,000 if they were charging by the day or by the hour. And that's an example of why choosing the right fee structure is so important, and why I recommend offering the hybrid structure. Many large clients, if you're working with like GE or IBM or a really big company like that, a lot of them won't accept a hybrid structure. It doesn't fit their model and what procurement can handle, the uncertainty there, and for a variety of reasons, they won't do it. Though sometimes they will, mostly they won't. If you're working with smaller firms, if your clients are a little bit smaller, they often will. They get it, they can deal with it. And so that's a nice place to be. One quick note, I've just shown sort of 6 structures, the 4 basic structures and 2 hybrids. All of that actually applies for projects. It doesn't apply for ongoing advice. If your offering is an advisory service, let's say it's coaching or mentoring, then you want to use a stipend. And that means if your offering is to provide, is something that's ongoing, it's open-ended, it's advice, and you're not working to create output, you're not working to create deliverables, then your fee structure should be regular periodic payments. For instance, it's $30,000 every quarter, or $8,000 a month, or something like that. But whether it's $8,000 a month, or it's $30,000 a quarter, or it's $45,000 for fixed time materials, or $65,000 for value-based fees, I mean, all these fees I'm tossing out there really raise the question, how did I come up with those fees? So how do you determine those fees in the first place? So let's talk about how you determine fees. How do you know what price to put on your services? And really, there's a lot to consider. I mean, there's a lot going on here. Your client's thinking about a lot, and you're thinking about a lot. On the client side, he's evaluating what he thinks the value of the project is, and he's thinking about his budget, maybe what fees your competition would charge for the project, and what the ROI of the project is. He's probably thinking about his cash flow, maybe how long he thinks the project will take. Maybe what the cost of his internal staff would be. That's pretty common. I mean, what if he did it inside? And how likely the project is even to succeed. So there's a lot going on in your client's head. There's a lot going on in your head too. You're thinking about what's it going to cost for you and for anyone else you might use on the project to complete this work, plus any overhead costs you have to cover. You may be thinking about whether you have a ton of clients, or on the flip side, whether you have a ton of capacity. And that influences whether there's an opportunity cost to taking this project. You might also be thinking about what size project is acceptable to you. A lot of work I do with, especially with small consulting firms and solos, is help them establish a higher minimum acceptable project size. So you're not just taking minnows, because you have to create room for larger projects. So maybe you need to be thinking about what the minimum acceptable project size is, and how much time, how much staff, how much resource this is going to require. So all of that's in your head. So there's just a lot to worry about on both sides. There's a lot going on, and I want to simplify it. I want to bring it really just down to a few things. So first, let me just give you 2 quick tips, and then we'll dig in a little bit more. Tip number 1 is to find out what the budget is upfront. Now, that's probably obvious, but it's also important, because knowing the budget makes determining your fees much easier. And I'll show you how to do that in just a moment. Tip number 2 is to trust your gut. If you have a strong feeling that your prospect won't pay, it will pay $125,000 and not a penny more, don't let someone else talk you into submitting alternatives that start at $175,000. Now that said, don't let fear hold you back from earning higher fees, but trust your gut. Okay, don't let rules or principles or some formulas, and I'm going to show you some ways to look through this, push you into a place that seems just flat out wrong to you. Your gut will give you a good sense. Okay, with those 2 tips in mind, let's go back to the beginning. The first thing you need to establish is whether or not this is a reasonable client for you. So let's say you're trying to win this super duper project, and your client has a certain willingness to pay. At the same time, you have a range that you're willing to accept to do this project. And if the top of his range is below the bottom of yours, you have a problem. And there's just no sense in spending tons of time doing research and coming up with a proposal if you're never going to meet on fees. And if that's the case, you want to find out, that out as early as possible. Well, how do you do that? How do you learn the client's budget? And here, the discovery process is your best friend. I'm a huge believer in the importance of discovery in consulting. At the very start of your conversations with a client about a specific project, you conduct discovery via what I call a context discussion. And we're not going to walk through all 6 parts of the context discussion here, but I'll tell you what, down here is a little link to the Guide to Winning Clients, and the entire context discussion is laid out there, including with examples and scripts. But we're not going to walk through the whole thing here. We're going to walk through maybe just one little piece of it. But during that discussion, you will actually broach the topic of budgets. And you're going to do that right after you establish the value of the project to your client. So immediately after you talk about value, what's this worth to you? What's the meaningful impact this will have on you, your business, your customers, your employees? Then you're going to talk about parameters. And one of those parameters is budget. And there are a few specific questions that I recommend during this part of the conversation. For instance, I flat out ask folks whether there are any budget parameters I need to know about. And if the client has already set a budget, they may tell you here. If not, it's still worth asking, because what you're hoping to find out, and again, I would just ask this directly, is, for instance, are there any signing limits? Is there any authority that they cannot go beyond that's going to cap your fees? Actually, an example of this came up yesterday. Yesterday, one of the consultants I work with out on the West Coast called me about a project he's trying to close. And he said his client only has a signing authority of $60,000. And he wanted to know, should he submit a fee higher than that? Should he submit an alternative higher than that? And my answer was no, of course not. Not unless he wants to start this whole discovery process over again with a higher level manager who has less urgency around this project and is less likely to sign. So if there are signing limits, if there's a signing authority, respect that. That is super helpful. There's another question I like to ask, which is, what were you anticipating the fees would be for this project? So after we talk about it a little bit, we talked a little bit about the value of what would happen. I said, what were you thinking? What were you anticipating the fees might be, or your investment might be in this? And this is a bit softer than asking for just budget. And I have found personally that prospects are more likely to share what they're thinking in response to this question. Again, just for an example, 2 weeks ago, I was chatting with a prospective client about a little project. The fees I had in mind were in the $20,000 to $40,000 range. And I asked him what he was anticipating. And then he started talking about how last year he had paid an agency $60,000 to work on similar issues. Now, it wasn't the same project, but he was setting a reference price that was higher than I was thinking. So I was glad I asked. And a lot of the time, whichever question you ask, your prospects won't give you a good answer. They'll say they don't know. I really don't have. We haven't set a budget. We want to know what you're going to come back with. All this kind of stuff, which isn't even remotely helpful. And in those cases, almost any case, but especially in those cases, one of my favorite questions works there, which is the heart attack question. And I'll say something like, "Okay, fair enough, but I don't want to come back with a fee that's so high it gives you a heart attack. I found that giving my clients cardiac arrest is actually bad for business. So what fee, if I came back with it, would just make you keel over?" So that question, which you'll want to rephrase, you'll want to put it in your own words, it injects some levity into the conversation, which is useful when you're talking about fees, because fees can be sensitive on both sides. People on both sides are worried about it. But that question also does something much more interesting, which is why I use it. Let's say that prospect's initial willingness to pay is in this range that I put up here. And whether a client admits it or not, whether they tell you or not, they always have something in mind. They have some budget in mind, at least some order of magnitude. Then you ask the heart attack question, like I just did. And that question reframes the client thinking, because inside his head, he's thinking, well, I was hoping to spend only $100,000, but geez, what would give me a heart attack? Right? And that heart attack changes things. And so he says, well, look, I can tell you for sure that if you came back with $250,000, I would be in shock and you would never win the project. And just like that, he's actually raised his own reference price and his willingness to pay goes up. And that's why I asked the heart attack question. So let's assume you've gone through this. Let's assume you've gone through discovery and you're comfortable now that you have some sense of your prospect's budget and you've decided it within reason. So you're going to continue the process. Well, how do you actually establish your fees? I'm going to start with the easy case of time and materials, or day rates, hourly rates, that kind of thing. And even though I'm not a huge fan of these fee structures, if you're in a highly commoditized market or area, or you're bidding on government contracts, you may have to price this way. In a time and materials environment, you have to look at your competitors. There's typically a range of fees that other consultants charge for the same work. Maybe there's someone who lowballs, and maybe there's some super premium consultant out there. Usually there's a lot of consultants kind of clustered around the same rate. So just take a look, see what's out there. And then you need to consider your expertise, the client experience you deliver, and most importantly, your credibility compared to the market. The more credible you are, the higher you can charge relative to competitors. It's really about credibility. And it's not about what you think of your own experience. It's about what the client thinks and how credible that makes you. And time and materials pricing is really as simple as that. Look at the market, compare your credibility, your client experience, your expertise to the market. Now, on the other side, if we're looking at value-based fees, that's a bit trickier. Here, the place you want to start is the value formula. And the value formula is actually what you used back during the context discussion, right before you asked about, you started broaching the budget conversation, when you were establishing the value of your project with your prospect. In other words, this is information you figured out during discovery. Discovery, I can't emphasize how important that is. And at that point, you asked your prospect, why he was bothering to do this whole super duper project. What was the meaningful impact on the company? And my experience is that in most cases, you have to help your prospects think this through, that they haven't thought it through well on their own. And you have to bring in factors like the time horizon and the multiplier effect and additional benefits of the project. And you talk this through with them. And you might figure out, let's just say you figure out that the total value of achieving his outcomes is, let's just say it's $6 million for sake of argument, so we can make this a little bit more concrete. And we'll say it's $6 million over 3 years. Well, once you figure that out, you have to start factoring that number down. That's what the value formula does. After all, your project is only one piece of him achieving his outcome. So you ask him, what else is involved in getting to nirvana and how much your project contributes. For instance, you might decide together that your project only delivers 60%, or let's say even 50%. So let's say you decide, we're only doing 50% of this. There's other things that contribute to achieving that $6 million. This project's maybe half, so $3 million. And then amazingly, you're going to factor this down again, based on the contribution that you, as an outside consultant, bring to the party. So you ask about the benefit of using a consultant versus internal staff. And that's an incredibly powerful question that is going to help you close the project later. It's going to make closing much easier. What I'll tell you is prospects' answers to this question, what's the contribution of a consultant, is kind of all over the map. And just go with whatever they say. Let's say they think they could get with their internal staff, if they tried it and they had the time, that they could get halfway to Bright with their own staff, which means of the $3 million that we were playing with, now we're saying the value that the consultant brings is $1.5 million of it. That's what's attributable to you, the consultant. Now, I actually like to cut that down one more time. I like to cut it down for risk. I'll ask the prospect how likely he thinks the entire project is to succeed. And usually they're pretty confident. So again, let's say we agree to 80%. We'll say there's an 80% likelihood that we succeed, which means we've cut it from $1.2 million, now 80%, so $1.2 million. And that's the risk-adjusted value of bringing me in, the consultant, or bringing you in as a consultant to do this project. And all that number does is set a reference point for you and for the client. Now, I generally take that number and divide it by 7 to give myself a starting point on price. So 7-to-1 return is a good return for a client. And all this is a stake in the sand. So in this case, let's see, we started with 6 million. We decided the project was worth 3 million of that. And then the consultant contributed half, that was 1.5 million. We adjusted it down to 1.2 million. That was the risk adjusted. So if we do 7-to-1, that's going to come out somewhere like 170 to 200. And that's kind of my starting point. That's my stake in the sand, maybe $170,000 to $200,000. But then I'm going to check that number against a couple of things. First, what does my gut sense of what's reasonable tell me? If this project would take me or any other smart, experienced consultant 3 days of work, and the value formula spits out $15 million, I'm going to adjust downward. this is just a stake in the sand. It's not gospel. Your gut and your common sense should always prevail. At the same time, if the value formula spits out $6.84, I'm going to immediately tell the client that this isn't a project worth doing. And I'm going to suggest we focus on something else that's higher value. Let me go back up for a moment because there are a couple of questions that come in that I didn't see. Someone asked whether the fee structure changes by client. The answer is it changes more by project, but by client, sometimes if you're working with the federal government, for instance, you don't have a lot of choice on fee structure. Other than that, I would make the fee structure just go with the best fee structure, which is value-based hybrid. Someone asked how you measure success in a way the client that doesn't screw you. So there's a whole discussion around how to set success fees, and I suggest binary behavioral-based fees, things you can measure and you either succeed or you don't, not some sort of percentage. And then finally, someone here also asked how you know what market prices are. Well, you call around. Your prospect may also tell you, but you can find out what rates are. It's actually not that hard to find out what other folks are charging. And someone's saying, well, what if they trust their gut feeling and won't fear override your gut? Well, again, some of this is balanced. Pricing is a little bit of an art. Like I said, it's tricky. That's why the value formula gives you a stake in the sand. So if you're thinking, wow, $10,000, and you run through the value formula and you realize this is worth $10 million to your client, $10,000 is silly. It's too low. What your gut may tell you is that you are, it doesn't make sense to charge $1 million because you may not get that, but you don't let your fear drive you to $10,000. And then I want to go on in just a moment. I'll answer one more question, which is about binary. In other words, I'll give you the example. I showed the example of that project I did for the West Coast company on integration, and we were doing a plan. And so I set up a hybrid fee structure, which I showed you, and said we'll charge $35,000 base, and then $60,000 if we succeed. Now, what's the success metric? The success metric was whether they used any part of our plan. So if they used the plan that I developed, it was by definition successful. If they wanted to decide, you know what, we don't think this was worth it, they had to return my plan and sign something saying they would use no part of the plan. And I'm okay with that because I work, with ethical clients. So that's a binary behavioral-based determinant of whether or not you get a success fee. Okay, let's dive back in. We established sort of the stake in the sand, and we checked it against sort of reasonableness and gut. Understanding gut is, it's loose. That's one thing you want to check. The other thing you want to check, of course, is against what your sense is of what the client's willingness to pay is, which you found out back in discovery. So let's say you run through the value formula and you end up at $30,000 and the client's willingness to pay is $75,000. You may want to reevaluate your approach to the project and beef it up a bit. On the other hand, like the example I gave just a minute ago, if the value formula shows $15 million and the client's willingness to pay is only $200,000, then you want to adjust downwards and keep keep in mind sort of your gut sense of what's fair and what's reasonable. Okay, one quick question. Is it ethical to wait for the client to blink? Absolutely. I think the question is a little bit, is it ethical to charge high fees? And will you always go along with high fees if the client's willing to pay for it? The answer is it's absolutely ethical to high fees. As a matter of fact, to charge high fees. As a matter of fact, I think it's in the client's best interest to have a project where the fees are higher and it gives you the room as a consultant to do whatever it takes to achieve success. Because the value of success far outweighs some small increment in the cost of the project. And if it doesn't, then all of your numbers were wrong. Remember, I was working off of a 7-to-1 return. So even if I double the fees on the project, it only takes a small improvement in the likelihood of success or the actual success of the project to pay that out. But let's say, now let me go back to this example from just the other day or last week when I had, I think, 20 to 40 in mind, and the client put this reference price at 60. I didn't come in at 60 because I didn't think that was the right price for my project. But I didn't stick with 20 either. I realized there was room to build him a better project, and that's what I did. Sometimes if you've been listening to this, you might be thinking, this whole value thing sounds really complex and difficult. And I think that's a fair concern. And so on the one hand, I absolutely don't want you to get twisted up in your knickers on this. It takes some time, it takes some practice, it takes some coaching to get good at this. And it's actually more important to understand the soft benefits of a project than the quantitative value. Those soft benefits are what will close the project. So don't tie yourself up in knots on this. On the other hand, it's absolutely worth learning to do this right. There's a consultant I work with in the Mid-Atlantic region, and we've been working together for a few years, practicing the context discussion, sort of role-playing and working through the value formula. And last year, he was able to use this approach to shift a project that would have been, I'm guessing around $60,000, this is what he told me, in time and materials, to about a $300,000 value-based fixed project. And then just in the past 4 weeks, he used the exact process I just described to close a project worth around $800,000. And that's a pretty darn good payout. And this is a solo consultant. So it's worth learning, it's worth doing the practice and getting the coaching. The final step then in determining fees is to continue discovery by submitting multiple fees. And you attach these to different bundles of approaches and terms. And submitting multiple alternatives with different fees allows you to understand what's most important to your client. And also to use some sophisticated pricing strategy, depending on sort of how you spread these out, where the gaps are, you can play with it to direct your client toward the alternative that you want them to select. And finally, you may be wanting to know how competition fits in. I already told you in time and materials how it fits in, which is it fits in a lot. You have to pay attention to competition if it's time and materials. But if you're pricing on a value basis, I wouldn't actually worry about competition. I would focus on the value of the outcome to your client. That's the most important factor, and what your client is willing to pay. I've pretty routinely won projects for anywhere from 30% to 3 times more than my competitors were charging. And if you set fees based on market averages, you'll achieve below average results because many of those projects you won't even win. I like to set high fees. I don't win every project, but I do bring in a lot of revenue. Okay, that was pretty good. It's 40 minutes. So that was a whirlwind tour of pricing. Here's a quick summary of what I went through. We talked about 6 fee structures that were derived from 2 decisions: the basis on which you determine fees and when those fees are determined. My suggestion is the best fee structure is a value-based hybrid with a success fee component. I also suggest you flee from any projects that are variable price with a cap. I wouldn't even play. I would just say no thank you. When it comes to determining the actual price, get the budget and trust your gut. Use discovery to determine your prospect's willingness to pay, then determine whether that's worth your time. During discovery, you can also use the value formula to give yourself a stake in the sand on fees, then compare that to what's reasonable and the client's willingness to pay. And there you go. That's a lot. That should give you at least a head start on pricing to win projects and to maximize your profit. In a moment, I'm going to open this up to Q&A. Before I do that, I want to give a shout out to ACE that hosted this. They're an excellent association. And also, I mentioned at the beginning, I want to sort of plug the live session I'll be doing with them in Maine next Friday. Everything I just talked about is just a little teeny piece inside the 6-step model that I'm going to be walking through on Friday on how to win clients. And so if you are within driving distance of Portland, Maine, I invite you to please join us. It will be fun. It always is. If you're not, and you haven't bought this book, I do encourage you to do it. Buy it. I think you'll find it useful. And there's a link. I don't think you can click on it, but it's Guide to Winning Clients. And with that, I'll say thank you. And we did this exactly in the time we were hoping. And I'll turn this up. I'll open this up for Q&A. So there's a Q&A little thing there. You can type it in Q&A, or you can type in the chat. I'll take a couple questions. If there's someone from ACE on the line, feel free to unmute yourself, and we'll go from there. And if there's no questions, we'll just close things out. So if you have a question, by all means, type it in, and I'll take them as they come.
While we're waiting for questions, David, let me step in here. This is Bill Stone. I'm the president of ACE, and I was going to be your host at the very beginning, but I had some technical problems on my end, and I apologize for any awkwardness. You very well demonstrated the importance of being an agile consultant when you're faced with unusual situations, and I thank you for that. I am going to, while people are composing their questions, I'm going to switch to a screen here that will help our participants see some things about ACE. And as you've observed, we have regular educational programs, ample opportunity for networking and promotion. We, as you see from our logo, success through collaboration is our mantra, and that's how we build a referral base. We're all in this together, and as a result, you can become a very powerful company because you have a variety of resources you can bring to those special contracts. And of course, we have a lot of events such as conferences and trade shows and webinars that our members can participate in. And of course, as you've just said, we're having a wonderful program next Friday that David is going to help us with. And this will be the second time David has presented for us. And it was very well received last time, as you can well imagine it would be after today's presentation. And that's right nearby Portland. It's about a half an hour from the Portland Jetport, if you're so ambitious, and would love to have you. And I also like you to consider that we do have a broad range of memberships that we're developing, because so many of you could benefit what ACE has to offer, and certainly ACE can benefit from collaborating with you, even though you may not want to participate in the in-person opportunities because just time and distance. In fact, we have actually international members, and I have no idea what they look like, but we benefit from their participation. So at this point, David, I imagine you have some questions.
Yeah, there are a ton of questions. So let me share my screen again, and because sometimes I scribble on the screen. Actually, there were questions that came in that I didn't realize, and I didn't see them because I didn't scroll down one thing. So lots and lots of questions, and let me answer them as best I can and as much as I can. There we go. Now we've got both. Okay, so I'll go through as many questions as I can in a reasonable amount of time. And there's let me just answer one that's come up a few times, which is, will there be a replay of this? My understanding is there will be, so you'll be able to save this for posterity. We'll send it to the Library of Congress and all that, or at the very least, you'll get to listen to it again. So folks have asked a lot of questions. For instance, what's my opinion on offering introductory rates for new consultants who haven't proven themselves yet? I absolutely don't like that at all. So either have confidence in your offering and offer it, or don't. the idea of, well, here's a consultant who's not well proven, that's really almost everything about rates and everything about contracts actually has to do with risk and risk allocation. And what you're saying is, whoa, you know what? I think the risk on this person's pretty high, so I'm going to lower the fee. If I'm a client, I run from that. Because again, the value of the outcome is just far outstrips the cost of a project, which is why credibility is so important. What really wins projects is credibility, reliability, just those sorts of factors. That's what clients are looking for. Someone said, during discovery, I get no information about budget or expectation. What then? Well, I would suggest you ask. I've given you a few questions to ask. If someone says, well, gosh, I have no idea, then I'll say, well, Bob, at least give me an order of magnitude here. Are you thinking $100, $1,000, $1 billion? I mean, just so I don't come in at $1 billion when you're thinking $100. And that's all you're trying to get to, and that will help you get the conversation started. Someone says, how do you define risk-adjusted value to a client? Well, it's simply adjusting for the chance that the project doesn't deliver any value at all. What's the value of bringing in a consultant to do this project for you? Just like that. Should fees mostly be payable up front? Let me see if I can get to this thing here. Should fees be payable up front? Here's your fees. On a small project or a project that's like a speech or one-day session, it's 100% upfront. I like to do more often something along the range of 50% upfront. I will never go below 30%, and then the other 50% in, say, 45 days. That's kind of a fee structure, a term structure that I like. But this is something you can play with. This is definitely up for negotiation. Someone asked how you figure out the value of an assessment project. That's a really good one. So there's a few ways to think about this, to think about assessments. Let me set this up so that I'm sharing this again. The way I tend to think about projects is in terms of, are we developing a strategy? Are we making a decision, which is what an assessment does? Or are we figuring out a plan, or are we actually doing implementation? And if we're doing implementation, or if we're doing an assessment, which is figuring out strategy, that's maybe tops 30% of the project's value. And so that's what I'll start to think, what's the total value? Now, what would the value of an assessment be? And assessments maybe, I don't know why that's doing that. I apologize. Assessment is maybe 10% to 30% of your total project. There was another question, which is there any situation where value pricing does not work? And the answer to that is yeah, absolutely. If you are in a very commoditized market, then it often doesn't work. So, then you can't do it. Or if you are working with government type contracts, it might not work. So that's another factor. Let me just do this one more time. All right, we're able to draw here. So those are a couple of examples where value-based might not work, but in general, you should be able to get there. Someone asked what the average win percentage is for projects. Well, that's kind of separate. That's a really separate discussion. And you kind of have to think of the entire pipeline. I recommend sort of a 6-step pipeline or way of tracking your projects. So I'm not sure where you want to think of that from, but if it's from proposal, this very last stage, if it's from propose and what percentage of them do you close, I would suggest anything north of 50% is fine. That's perfectly acceptable. If you're doing above 80%, that's excellent. If you are doing 100%, your fees are too low. Someone asked, you're talking about 7-to-1. What if a client uses 4-to-1? No big deal. Use 4-to-1. Again, you're just getting in the range. Someone said time and material seems to be the standard expectation with smaller companies. How do you go about moving them to more of a fixed value and success structure? Really great question, and not always easy. The real big factor here for you is whether or not this is an existing client you've worked with before or not. If it's an existing client you've worked with before and you've offered time and materials fees in the past, it's difficult to transition. However, if it's a new client and they say, "What's your rate?" And I say, "I don't have a rate," then you've probably heard some of this language before, but I'll repeat it to you, exactly what I would say. They say, "Well, what do you mean you don't have a rate?" So I don't charge based on rate. I charge a fee based on the value to you so that you get a great return and I get paid equitably. And they may say, "Well, what if, what if it only takes 1 day?" I say, "Well, that's great. That's better for you. If it only takes 1 day, that's more valuable for you than if it takes 2 years. Which would you pay more for? The outcome in 1 day or the outcome in 2 years?" And usually just bringing them through some of the logic will get them to see that paying time and materials is not in their best interest. It's not the smartest thing to do. Someone says, "What did you mean by 7 to 1? How did you come up with that figure?" That's actually, if you go back, I'm going to suggest you actually look in the book or go back through the presentation. It's a 7 to 1 return on risk-adjusted value. It usually comes up with a pretty good, it's just a good benchmark. That's through experience and a lot of working with a lot of clients. So let's see, what else has come in? What's the time horizon for determining value of the project? What metric for value do you recommend? So time horizon is, I would generally look at 3 years. That's my preference. It depends on the client. Sometimes it's a one-time shot, right? So there's no time horizon. But I once had a consultant come to me and they were pricing their project based on this sort of ongoing infinite stream of revenue. That's nice, but it's not going to happen. None of us can predict what the world is going to be like in 3 years or 5 years. So I find 3 years, usually most clients go, "Okay, yeah, that seems pretty fair." Someone asked a really good question here. If you do fixed price, so let's say here's your fees. You say, I'm gonna do fixed price. We're gonna charge right there. And your hours go way long. So let's say your costs are way up here. Then what? Do you eat it? Do you just rediscuss it? Do you reduce hours? What do you do? Okay, I really like that. So here, here's sort of fixed fee, and here's your reality. Okay. The answer to that is it depends on how you got there. So if you went in and you said, based on my understanding of the scope, we're going to charge $150,000 for this, and you checked your gut, you went back and you said, "Yep, this is reasonable. I'm okay with that." And then you get into it and you just messed up. That's pretty much on you. If you're going to take a complete bath, you might want to have a conversation with your client. That's fair. You can say, "Look, I really screwed up. This is just way harder than I anticipated, and I'd like to discuss with you whether it's you'd be open to sort of rethinking the fees." But if they say no, that's on you. If the client changes the scope, if they say, "Well, we actually want to also add the division in Guam and the division in Zimbabwe, and you are only doing the division in Iowa," and all of a sudden your fees, your costs have gone way up, that's not on you. It's only on you if you accepted that work without renegotiating fees. So you have to renegotiate the fees. In order to do fixed fees, of course, you have to have some sense of what you're doing, which means you should be relatively good or experienced at this. And if you're not, I would suggest you partner with someone who is your first time around, and so you get a sense of what's normal, what's reasonable. Let's see. Someone asked, and let's make this the last question. How do you set value for nonprofit clients who think about ROI differently? Oh, nonprofits. Okay. You're absolutely right. Nonprofits tend to think about things differently. They're easier to work with than hospitals often. Hospitals have more than one way of thinking about ROI. In general, I don't think about nonprofits any differently. Just because they're a nonprofit doesn't mean they don't have money. It's what it does mean is their managers tend not to be as professional, and so they need more guidance. But I charge nonprofits, unless I'm doing a pro bono project, I look at them the same way I look at any other business. It is sometimes tougher for them to figure out, what's the value of this. In which case, I'm not going through the value formula quite as rigorously, because it doesn't make any sense to them. Their metric isn't how much revenue we're bringing in or how many costs we're saving. It might be how many members we have. But often it does have to do with things like how many contributions are we bringing in. And so often it does translate back to that. But if it doesn't, no big deal. No big deal. I'm going to focus on soft benefits. I'm going to really understand their willingness to pay and see how that compares to whether it's acceptable to me. And that's going to determine the fees. There's still questions coming in. By all means, type them in. It's useful to have those questions. If I get a chance, I'll continue to answer them. But I think that takes us pretty close to the end of the hour, and I wanted to give Ace a chance to round this out. Thank you all for staying. Thanks for participating. If you have questions, feel free to shoot me an email also.
And thank you, David, and thank all of you for participating in this program. And once again, if you're interested in ACE, there's our website on your screen, and we hope to be hearing from you. And with that, I hope to see one other little thought. Somebody had a question about would these slides be available? And if you are a member of ACE, you can see portions of this presentation from our website, and would love to have you access that. And so with that, thank you very much for your attention, and we hope to see you at future webinars.